Welcome to Dreamit Live. We have a great panel of experts with us today who made time out of their day for us, which is greatly appreciated.
Well, let me tell you where not to start, and that's with the Magic Quadrant. We have the world's best mousetrap. See, I have a business model advantage and a pricing advantage.
Let's go back and forth. We're talking about going from secondary school to university. Hi, I'm Steve Barsh, Managing Partner of Dreamit Ventures, and welcome to Dreamit Live. Streaming to you again today from Philadelphia. On today's show, I'd like to welcome Steve Case, who's joining us. I think probably everybody in the world knows you, but a quick background. Steve is Chairman and CEO of Revolution, a great investment firm based out of the DC area. They span seed, venture, and growth stages. He was co-founder of this little internet startup called America Online that kind of started the whole thing off, AOL. On today's show, we're going to talk to Steve with COVID-19 in mind. We're going to talk about a few different topics. What are the emerging opportunities because of COVID-19? And we'll talk about that. And maybe what are some business areas that are going to really struggle in sunset? I think we know some of them, but I think we'll cover a couple of more. How could this, all of what we're all going through, how can it affect the future of work and where it takes place? We're going to hit upon that, and how new entrepreneurial ecosystems may blossom and how venture paradigms may shift because of all of this, which would be kind of unexpected from 2 or 3 months ago. And then finally, we'll talk about what can startups do to survive and thrive during these challenging times. If you strongly agree or disagree or have questions, please put them in the comments. We're going to do a Q&A with Steve for about 10 minutes at the end. So if you have questions, put them in the comments. In the interim, let's dive in. Steve, welcome to Dreamit Live. How are you today?
Great to be with you, Steve. Doing well.
Great to have you. Where are you today, by the way, in the world?
I'm in
DC?
rural Virginia. We have a kind of a farm about an hour outside of Washington, D.C., which is where Revolution's headquartered. So my wife and I have been sheltering here for most of the past couple of months, which is a pretty good place to be because you can walk around. What's not so good is the connectivity isn't great. So we have really lousy broadband here. So sometimes we lose connections. Hopefully we won't today. But it is amazing. You mentioned in the intro the kind of history with AOL. We started in 1985, so 35 years ago. Only 3% of people were connected, and they're only connected 1 hour a week. And so now a world where everybody's connected, and essentially the world is operating online while we're all working from home, or many of us are working from home. It is amazing how the transformation has happened over the last several decades and how it's really kicked in, obviously, in the last couple of months.
Yeah, and even to be able to do things like we're doing now, where you watch a CNN broadcast and everyone's remote and it's all going over broadband, it's amazing. I wanted to hit, I know in your background and bio, I wanted to hit a little bit more things that I missed. I mean, if I listed your whole bio, the whole show would take your bio. Are there things, a couple things, like you mentioned AOL. I just wanted for the audience, our primary audience are startups. And I think what's interesting is so many startups think, I've been working on this for 6 months and it really hasn't taken off yet. I mean, what's taking so long? AOL, if I remember correctly, that was not an overnight success. How long were you at that till you felt comfortable, like, hey, this is a winner?
It was a long haul. It was really kind of a 10-year in the making overnight success. When we started, as I mentioned, in 1985, nobody really knew about or cared about getting online. It was really hard to raise venture capital. We raised $1 million in the first year. In the 7 years before we went public in 1992 as the first internet company to go public, over those 7 years, we raised $10 million in total. And even the IPO, we raised $10 million in the IPO. The value of the company was $70 million. That was 7 years after we got started. So, of course, now everybody understands the importance of the internet. Everybody's online, classes are online, works online, everything's online. But in the 80s and for a good part of the 90s, it was still viewed as sort of a fringy idea. Maybe some computer hobbyists would see the benefit of getting online, but most normal, average people wouldn't. And it took us a while. Part of our focus at AOL is how do you make it easier to use, more useful, more fun, more affordable? How do you create a mass market? How do you get America online? And obviously, eventually that happened. But it took a decade before most people paid attention.
Well, no, it's interesting. Still on your background, too. I want to start to talk about Revolution. As we get into that just for a moment, for Revolution, again, how long ago did you start that for Revolution Ventures? And let's go right into our first topic. So Revolution, when, where, and what? Give us the background.
Well, it was really, so AOL started in 85. We merged with Time Warner in the year 2000 as part of that deal. I stepped aside as CEO, so started thinking about what I was going to do next and started making some investments in some companies. Formalized that 15 years ago, as 2005, by creating Revolution. But for the first 5 or 6 years, it really was more of a family office. The investments we made, companies like Zipcar, one of the first kind of sharing economy companies, and Swiss Resorts and others really were my capital. It was only probably 9 years ago now that we decided to turn it into much more of a institutional platform, an investment platform. We've now raised 2 growth stage funds, about $1 billion there, 2 venture stage funds, over $400 million, and then 2 seed funds, about $300 million. So it's evolved from 15 years ago. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, kind of what the next act was, started making more personal investments, and it's scaled now to be a little under $2 billion under management and much more of an institutional fund as opposed to what it started at. And then part of the reason I decided to do it was I really believe they're great entrepreneurs who are going to create the future, and wanted to build a team to help those companies kind of start and scale. And we did decide to basically create these different funds so we can try to work with entrepreneurs wherever they are in that entrepreneurial journey. If it's a really early startup, we will be seed investors that are starting to show a little bit of progress. They need to raise more of a Series A venture round. We can help them there. And if they've got some scale and are really trying to go for it and build a significant company, we have a team and the funds there to invest at the growth stage.
I want to break that down and do a little bit more detail, because I think it's important for this audience watching now or on a rewatch to understand the verticals you're in, the geographies, because it's that, like, who are you to opine on the future of work and what's going to happen? Just a little bit more detail. So the first of those 3 funds, the distinct funds as you went to, is the seed fund, right? Rise the Rest. So Rise the Rest, what's the stage geography, just like 30 seconds in each, stage geography and industries that you look at for Rise the Rest?
Well, Rise the Rest, we just started about 5 years ago, started making investments and formalized the funds just 2 or 3 years ago. So it's still our earliest activity. But we recognize that most venture capital goes to a few places. Last year, 75% of venture capital dollars went to just 3 states, California, New York, Massachusetts. So if you're in Silicon Valley or New York City or Boston, it's pretty easy to raise capital. If you're in most parts of the country, it's actually pretty hard. And so the Rise the Rest Seed Fund was designed to partner with regional venture funds. Our initial check is under $1 million as part of some larger rounds. The regional fund take the lead in setting the terms. The regional fund take the lead in terms of board seats and active engagement in the company. Our effort is to be part of that syndicate and then work with these different companies to help scale them. So we've made now 135 investments out of the Rise the Rest Seed Fund in 70 plus cities, 30 plus states, alongside 200 plus regional venture funds. So that's really off to a great start. It is a place-based strategy. So the Rise the Rest Fund will invest in any place outside of Silicon Valley, outside of New York City, outside of Boston. So really the rest of the country, and is sector agnostic. So we invest in a lot of different sectors in partnership with other venture capitalists.
Got it. So a little more. So that's seed stage. Then Revolution Ventures. So if we look at Revolution Ventures, stage, geography, industries, same type of thing.
That is more of that Series A, kind of sometimes Series B stage. Usually the initial check is $5 million, $7 million, something like that. Companies typically have scaled to the point where maybe they're a $20 million valuation, something give or take. And that is, will invest anywhere in the country, but they too have a bias looking outside of Silicon Valley because there's just so much capital there.
Right.
And looking other parts of the country. Some of the investments we've made have been in the Washington D.C. area where we're based, but we've made investments all over the country. Recently, we made an investment in Detroit called Bloomscape, and an investment in Milwaukee called Bright Sellers. We invested in Chicago, a company called Paro, in D.C., a company called Framebridge. So interesting entrepreneurs building interesting disruptive businesses, challenging the status quo, and e-commerce is part of it. Marketplaces are a part of it. So there's certain sector focus, but they've been open to investing in a variety of entrepreneurs at that kind of Series A venture stage.
Got it. Last one, Revolution Growth Stage, maybe some of the big brands, just 30 seconds on it, just to give people a feel, and then we'll go into the next topic.
It really is when the companies have scaled from kind of that startup to almost like a speed up. They're really accelerating, and they need $20, $30, $40 million of capital, which is typically what we're investing at that stage. Some of the companies, one recently actually just went public a couple of weeks ago called DraftKings. We've also invested in other sports tech companies. Sport Radar is one. Some mobile gaming companies like Scopely. Some restaurant concepts, Sweet Green and Kava. We also invested in Revolution Foods, which works with school lunches, and a company in Chicago, Tempest, that's doing some really interesting things around big data, machine learning, and oncology, cancer, trying to be more specific in terms of the diagnosis. We've done some things in the office kind of real estate space, a company called Convene, digital mental health, a company called Talkspace that's providing mental health, which obviously becoming an increasingly important problem in society, even more so during this crisis. People can't have in-person physical appointments, so they use Talkspace for that. So a variety of different sectors, but it really are the companies that are showing real promise. They usually have tens of millions of revenue already, usually have pretty clear business model, pretty intact team, but they really think they can go for it. And they need the capital and some of the expertise we can provide around helping them with strategic partnerships, helping them on some public policy issues, helping them as they kind of take these companies to the next stage. So it's been fun to be an investor at all three stages and try to help entrepreneurs wherever they are in that cycle.
Okay, all three stages, geographically extremely diverse, especially staying out of those three big states, and all industries, right? So very diverse. So let's dive in really into our second topic that starts to get into the meat of it, and I appreciate that background. Talking about new opportunities and what businesses maybe are most at risk. So let's start on the negative side for a bit. And I just wanted to explore this with you and get your thoughts. What are the verticals, maybe business models in geographies that you think might be at most at risk, kind of with a COVID-19 lens? And let me just give you an example, right? Are they verticals like travel and leisure, restaurants and retail? Or do you think certain cities are at risk? Is New York City and San Francisco, or Louisville, Wichita, and Tulsa, which I think Rise of the Rest was trying to go to this year? Are there business models or gig economy, sharing economy? Are they going to be tougher now? So let's do the negative first, and then we're going to hit the positive. Thoughts?
Well, I think the honest answer is it's too early to say, and it kind of depends, because we are investors in all those different sectors you mentioned, and it's really up to the companies to take a step back, recognize the world has changed. At some point, we'll get back to some sense of normal, but that new normal may very well be different, and in some sectors likely will be quite different. So trying to reimagine what the businesses look like after we get through the crisis. I mentioned Sweet Green is a fast casual company. They've had a lot of people ate the food in the restaurants. They've obviously had to close the restaurants, so they really amped up their focus on takeout and delivery. And just last week, actually launched an expanded menu, including some dinner items that they were planning to do next year and decided to accelerate and do now, given this particular crisis. So rather than just focus on the negatives of the crisis, they said, what are some new things we can do that can expand our model, expand our appeal, and when we come out of this crisis, we'll be an even stronger company. Clear, for example, is a company focused on airport security. Well, people aren't really flying. I think the current data is over 90% of the flights are down. Maybe it's even 95%. They're looking at some other opportunities to use some of their biometric technology and other things to move into other sectors, possibly even trying to figure out how to do some of these health screenings. So that's a case of taking a step back and saying, how do we pivot and look at different ways of doing things? I mentioned Sport Radar. DraftKings recently went public. That was sort of interesting because most people thought the public markets were closed and the IPOs weren't really possible. And a company going public that's focused on sports and partners with the major leagues, and is those leagues aren't playing, it was sort of counterintuitive, but they were able to build the momentum and tell the story. And now they're very well positioned and very well capitalized. When sports return, their growth has the opportunity to accelerate. So, of course, there are certain sectors that are going to be hit harder. You mentioned some of them. There'll also be new opportunities that may have been slowly building. And you've seen this certainly with work from home. You've seen this with distance learning. You've seen this with telehealth. They've really accelerated. The phrase you hear a lot now is the level of momentum in the last 2 months has been greater than it had been in the previous 2 years. So there's some things that are certainly accelerating, and those are great opportunities to be pursuing. But even the ones that are challenged, if entrepreneurs bring that fresh perspective, they can come out of this crisis even stronger than they entered it.
Right. No. Okay. I agree. And I was just thinking it's so funny because our daughter earlier today was like, can we go to Sweet Greens and get from Sweet Green tomorrow night? I just read Chipotle, like they're booming in this economy, right? They're just, it's amazing. So some fast casual, I guess, is doing really well. So let's talk more on where the opportunities are, right? So if you think about all of this, and I think it's interesting because I as entrepreneurs, it's almost like our duty and job. Like, how do we come out of this? What are the new ideas? So are there new opportunities that you think this is all causing, whether that's in certain verticals, certain geographies, which I promise we're going to drop into geographies deeper later as we talk about this, business models? Are there certain things that are excited across your different funds that you're like, we're looking for things that are taking advantage of this from a new startup perspective and, verticals, that type of thing?
Absolutely. No, we've now, through the 3 different funds, I've invested in nearly 200 companies across a lot of different sectors, and we're still open for business. We're actively looking at new investments and really believe there is going to be opportunity that this crisis creates. Anytime you have a crisis, obviously there's a terrible health dynamic to this. Now, 80,000 people have died, a terrible economic impact with, I think the last number I saw was 30 million people unemployed. So I don't want to underestimate the very serious, difficult challenges we're facing. But that also does create opportunity. And that's really where entrepreneurs flourish. I saw this as AOL got larger, and particularly after we merged with Time Warner. As you know, that merger did not work the way it was intended. Part of the reason, part of the problem was as we got larger, and certainly after we became AOL Time Warner, had 90,000 employees, I think it's $40 billion in revenue, the tendency was to play defense.
Right.
What made AOL successful and what makes most startups successful, most entrepreneurs successful, is playing offense, not trying to de-risk, but trying to maximize the opportunity, not focusing on managing the business, but imagining how the business can change. So as a result, it's not surprising that historically, in times of crisis, that's where some of the big breakthrough companies have been launched. So we think that will happen really all across the economy. I mentioned some of the sectors we're particularly interested in. Health is one of the most important aspects of our lives, as we know. That's why we have this crisis right now. We spend about 1/6 of the whole economy is health. But the reality is, despite some efforts to change, it's still relatively inconvenient, relatively unaffordable, relatively inaccessible, and often has relatively poor outcomes. Clearly, there's an opportunity for fresh thinking, not just technology, but fresh thinking about ways to offer different products and services. That clearly has been accelerated. I mentioned one example, Talkspace and the digital mental health area. There are many other examples. So that's just one of many sectors that is kind of up for grabs. This is sort of a kind of a shake the snow globe moment. And nobody knows exactly how long it will last. Nobody knows exactly how things will settle back in. But that's the most fertile time for entrepreneurs. Now, that said, it will be more difficult for entrepreneurs to raise capital in this environment. There are many folks who pulled back, so we need to focus on our current portfolio and manage that before we're willing to make new investments. So it's going to be more difficult to raise capital, particularly, as you said, we'll get to this, in some of the regions that we think of as rise the rest. So there'll be more challenges, but the companies that can break through that, imagine that new possibility, come up with a product or service that can really usher in a new and better way for people, assemble the right team, put together the right partnerships, and raise the capital to give it a shot. There are going to be some amazing companies that come out of this crisis.
Right. So we talked about what are some of the negatives, what are some of the models that will be challenged. We talk about a little bit what are some of the opportunities, verticals, or geographies, or business models. Let's say I'm a startup, I'm a CEO in your current portfolio, or one of the CEOs listening and watching today, and I'm running my company. What advice would you give them? I'm running my business. Where should I be focusing my time, and what distractions should I be tuning out? Because there's a lot of distractions, and it's a little bit like focus. What are you saying that you need to say to entrepreneurs? Focus on this. Stop messing around with this right now.
Well, we've been having weekly or biweekly, depending on what the topics calls with our companies, partly to advise them on what's happening with this health crisis. We have a great team at Revolution. Part of our focus has been on policy, partnering with government, understanding what changes in regulatory policy might impact either positively or negative different sectors, different businesses. One person in particular, Ron Klain, actually left us for a few months 6-7 years ago to become President Obama's Ebola czar. He's now back with us, and so it's quite expert in helping navigate through this COVID crisis. So initially, 2 months ago, the focus was just trying to make sure everybody understood the nature of the crisis and the seriousness of the crisis. And that led to a series of actions, most of the case kind of closing down some things they're doing, having their employees obviously work from home. It varied depending on the city. It varied depending on the sector. It varied depending on the size of the company. But that was really the focus. And there continues to be a lot of focus in managing through that situation. But now it's starting to shift a little bit into more in the reopening process, which actually likely will be more difficult than the closing process. It was relatively easy, even though it seemed hard at the time, to figure out ways to kind of pivot and wind some things down and move people to remote work. Figuring out when and how to bring them back on stream in a way that is safe for your team members, safe for your customers, et cetera, is going to be a big focus. But through that all, you need to make sure you're devoting enough time to not just managing through the crisis, but imagining, as I said before, how the world might change and how your company and your strategy needs to change to reflect that new reality. Nobody knows exactly what that new normal will look like, but it's going to be in many parts of our society, in many sectors of our economy, it's going to be different. And the companies that are using some of their time, granted, there's a lot of focus just on triage, managing the crises of the moment. I understand that, but taking some time to step back and just say, okay, based on this and some plausible scenario in terms of when and how things kind of return to some sense of normal, how might the world be different? How might our sector be different? How should our company, our product, our service be different? So you got to make sure you're devoting at least some of your time to that, not just playing defense, managing the crises of the day, even though I know there are many that you have to manage, and often it is more difficult to manage it when you're dealing with a remote workforce.
Just 2 quick points. It almost could be a Pareto principle, right? 80-20. 80% is on the current crisis. 20% is don't forget there's a future after this. Just a quick note, you're in great company. No surprise. Last week we had on Joel Peterson. Joel's chairman of JetBlue. And he has a new book, Entrepreneurial Leadership. He's like, entrepreneurial leaders will focus on the crisis, but then think about I have to remember, I have a business to run after this. And you can't forget about that. He said the same exact thing last week. So it's interesting. Let's move into the next topic. We're talking about books. I want to go to your book. So you wrote a book years ago, right? The Third Wave. And I wanted to talk about the intersection of what we're going through today with your book, The Third Wave, right? The entrepreneurial's vision of the future. And I just want to do a quick recap on that book, right? So the first wave was building the internet and awareness. Did that, done and did that, right? That was AOL. You did that personally. That was kind of cool. Second wave, building apps and services on top of that. The Facebooks of the world and Google's on top of that. Third wave, integrating, I know you know it, but just for the audience, integrating seamless and pervasive ways into every aspect of our lives, which is where we are today. And thank God, in a crisis like this, it's great that all of this technology is pervasive and helpful. But I wanted to go deeper into that. What do you think? You had written in that book that entrepreneurs are going to vastly transform real world sectors, healthcare, education, transportation. What do you think is the intersection with what's going to happen in entrepreneurships today and post, COVID and post-COVID with that third wave kind of thinking?
Well, they did a great job of summarizing the core tenets of the book. But part of it also was recognized. The reason I wrote the book is I recognized the playbook, the dynamics that drove the first wave of the internet. And obviously, I say about AOL, but there are many companies that helped stand up the internet and build the servers and build the connectivity and the modems and the computers, et cetera, that made it all possible. The principles that basically made that possible were different than the principles, the playbook, and the second wave. And I think this third wave, when the internet kind of meets the real world, the playbook will be more like the first wave. And some of the key dynamics that were so critical in that first wave, one was partnership. You couldn't do it on your own. AOL had over 300 partnerships with a whole variety of companies of a variety of different sectors. We all had to work together to make that happen. In the second wave, companies like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, they didn't really need partnerships. They had a great idea, a great app that spread virally, and suddenly they were big successes and had significant reach. In the third wave, we talked about some of this earlier, whether it be healthcare or food and agriculture or education, these are systems level changes. It's not just about the software, it's not just about what any one company does. It requires that partnership focus. Another big dynamic in those early days was policy. Even when we started AOL in 1985, believe it or not, it was still illegal for consumers or businesses to connect to the internet. At the time, the internet, which had been funded by the government, by DARPA, was restricted to educational institutions and government agencies. So companies like AOL and CompuServe and Prodigy and many others essentially had to create their own separate online world because they couldn't connect into the internet. So we had to focus on policy. How do you commercialize the internet? How do you open the doors? What should the rules of the road, tax and other kinds of things be around e-commerce? There was a whole host of policy issues critical in the first wave. The first wave couldn't have happened without those policy changes. Again, not very critical in the second wave. Will become very critical again in the third wave, given the nature of how important these sectors, healthcare, transportation, food, smart cities, things like that are. And the final principle, I call these in the book the three P's: partnership, policy. The third is perseverance. As you said at the very beginning, it was a 10-year journey before we finally kind of broke through. We didn't have the kind of overnight success that a Facebook or many other second wave companies did. In this third wave, it's going to take a while. It's going to be a slog. You're not going to have easy access to partnerships. It's going to take a while to change some of the policies. But it goes back to the core topic here. This crisis does create some dynamics that likely accelerate some of those dynamics. In the telehealth, for example, there have been restrictions around state. Each state does their own policies. Some of those are being relaxed to make this possible. Similarly, in terms of learning, there have been certain rules of the road that were put in place. Some of those have been relaxed. The question is, do those stick? Do some of the temporary changes become permanent changes, which can usher in an acceleration of these third wave businesses? So I think it's a great opportunity. Again, it's going to require a different mindset, focusing more on partners, understanding the role of policy, being willing to take the long view, be patient, and persevere. But the entrepreneurs that do that, I think, are going to build some of the great iconic companies of the next 10 or 20 years as this third wave really starts to accelerate.
Right. And I agree with what you're saying. And I would even say it's the entrepreneurs that realize those second order effects, right? Instead of, for years I was pushing my telehealth or I was pushing my distance learning. Now it's not a push, it's a pull, right? We had a second Dreamit company today, a second one received. So we do a lot of health tech, urban tech, and secure tech companies. A second health tech company today received an FDA clearance because of emergency use authorization, right? That would have been unheard of. They would normally go through regulatory path, but we have Dreamit companies who are just getting pulled forward. They're not pushing anymore. Same thing in distance learning and education, or like you talked about in telehealth, right? Was it about a month or two ago, sometime in the last 4 to 8 weeks, where doctors had state licensures? Well, I'm a Florida doctor. I can't talk to a patient who's in Virginia. Oh, never mind. Now all good, right? So it's really interesting how COVID, to me, I'm a big fan of the expression nitmoy, and I talked about it last week, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. Okay, bad things are happening. We got to move fast. We don't have a choice. So suddenly things start coming down. So when you talk about partnerships and all that, it's kind of interesting because things are accelerating. And I think it's interesting, like you talk, healthcare, education, food, some of those core areas that you talk about in the third wave, many of them will get pulled. And I think it's the entrepreneurs that recognize that say, wow, now is an opportunity. I mean, it's going to pull me forward.
Question. No question. And again, focusing specifically on COVID, it's a perfect example of the role of policy, the role of regulations. The agencies we have set up, the FDA and others, are really designed to protect people from bad things happening. And of course, we don't want drugs to be offered that are going to kill us or medical devices that are going to hurt us. We want things to be safe and that actually work, that have efficacy. So there is a logic why there are regulations in place in that sector. At the same time, that does result in things taking longer and costing more to develop. When we have a crisis like this, the reason people are more optimistic now than they might have been a couple of months ago about a vaccine for COVID is normally it takes 5+ years to develop a vaccine, but there's a lot of focus on it, a lot of investment in the companies that are pursuing this, and a fast tracking of the kind of trial and approval process that creates more momentum and more of that sense of possibility that maybe there is a possibility of getting in the next 6 or 12 months, something that normally would take 3, 5, 7 years. So you got to understand, it's part of this challenge in the third wave. The regulators aren't crazy. We as a society do want to have certain rules of the road. We do want to have certain protections, and that's part of what the regulations are designed to do. But there are moments like now where the focus can't be on keeping bad things from happening. It has to be on unleashing good things to happen. And that creates opportunity in the sectors that are get that opening, that unleashing. And as you mentioned, there are many sectors now that will get more energy, more investment, more momentum, and be able to accelerate their pursuit of mainstream acceptance because of this crisis.
Yep. Okay, cool. Let's move on to our next topic. That was great. Fourth topic, the future of work. So I want to put a little definition around that. Future of work, there's as you mentioned, massive unemployment, like 30 million people. The numbers are just staggering. Was that last week's unemployment number? Or is that the total? It's like these numbers are huge. Most people are work from home. I'm work from home. You're work from home. Most people are. Many have left big cities. I know people on Dreamit teams. We have Dreamit team members that live in New York City, but now they're in Philly or they're in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They're like, I'm out of here. I can't stay in New York right now. They've gone rural. They've gone to farms or elsewhere. So I want to talk about the future work. And let me give you a couple things, conversation starters maybe. First, would you expect to see some level of redistribution of labor, meaning people are going to move from retail and restaurants to warehouses, cloud kitchens, and delivery? There's a lot of people that are displaced jobs. Is that going to shift? Do you think it's going to accelerate some trends that were already happening?
I think that's likely. But first of all, in terms of many of us, so-called knowledge workers, kind of take for granted that everybody's working from home. About 70% of jobs cannot be done at home. It's just the nature of that. It includes some of the things that you mentioned, certainly healthcare, other sectors are like that. So part of the challenge is to think about, for that 30%, what are ways to reimagine what work looks like, reimagine what the office is. Maybe there is more of a hybrid between being in the office and being able to work from home or remotely. I think this has been a surprising wake-up call to a lot of CEOs, including a lot of big companies that didn't imagine this work from home could work as well as it has. So I think there will be a reassessment there. But we also need to focus on that 70% and make sure that those jobs are there, the new skills that are required for the jobs of the future are also built. And there is some migration, as you're suggesting, from some jobs into other jobs, because of when it all settles out, there may be more opportunity now here than there is there. At the same time, and there are different theories on this, my own view is that while work from home has some benefits, there are still benefits to being in an office environment, and some kind of hybrid makes sense. While delivery of food is certainly convenient, and this time it works pretty well, there is something about the social experience of being in a restaurant. Similarly, of course, being able to stream movies on Netflix or Hulu or what have you is convenient. There is something about being in a theater, which is a more social experience. So human nature tends to change more slowly than we think, and it's still unclear exactly how this all settles out. But it likely will change some of the things we do, but not necessarily in a revolutionary way. Some of the changes might be more evolutionary.
Okay, fair enough. I'll give you an example. By the way, a friend of mine, Doug Alexander, was on a Goldman Sachs real estate call a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about not redistribution of labor, but working from home and going to the office, and CEOs saying, wait, my team is productive and they're not in the office, which is not ideal all the time. But the example was, apparently there's a big law firm in New York City that had 10 stories of an office building. And right before this hit, they were about to sign their optional lease for an additional 5 floors of the office building. And of course, you can imagine what happened. They didn't sign the lease, and they're not going forward. Why? Because the law firm has realized during all of this, their employees are happier, they're commuting on average 2 hours less per day, and their billables are up. They're like, wait a second, we're making more money, our expenses are lower. It's just interesting, and but will that last? Human beings are social creatures. They want to be around other people. So what's that balance?
And also, I think it's been a particular challenge for folks who are working. Often, both people in both of the couple are working. They're, in addition to both trying to do their jobs, they're trying to also be the quasi teacher proctor for their kids, doing distance learning, trying to figure out how to, kind of manage their everyday kind of life. And it does create some challenges. So there are some people who have been comfortable working in this environment, maybe even prefer working in this environment and would like that to stay in place. And for some people, maybe it will. Others are eager to get back to, being a more normal kind of day and a more normal kind of office environment. I think a lot of people will be in the middle, and maybe when it settles out, people will still be in the office, 3-4 days a week, but 1 or 2 days a week, maybe they do continue to work in a more remote fashion. It will depend based on a company. It will depend obviously based on the on the sector. But there clearly will be some changes. How extensive those changes are, it's early to say. But again, this creates entrepreneurial opportunity. One of the companies that back Convene works with the landlords in terms of shared meeting spaces. So every office doesn't have to have their own meeting spaces, and they can manage them for an entire building. And they're looking hard at what is the future of work. How do people kind of move back into this, and what opportunities are created by that transition?
Right. Do you think, to drill into that a little bit more, do you think you'd see a material percentage change? So we're going to start to get more into this kind of rise of the rest things. From big cities, people moving out of the San Franciscos, New Yorks, Bostons, the world. And, I know a lot of people right now, they went back home. I'm from Iowa. I'm not from Palo Alto. And it's kind of nice to be back home. And oh, by the way, it's so much cheaper and I love it here. I live in Park City. I know somebody in Park City, Utah. It's gorgeous. And I'm getting my work done. And you see a lot of, particularly, these are tech companies, right? So people that can work remotely are like, why am I doing this? Why am I beating myself up? Would you expect to see some level of material change of people moving out of cities to rural, suburban, or home?
Yes, I think I've been saying for some time, as part of what we've been working on with Rise the Rest, our goal was to level the playing field, so everybody everywhere really had a shot at the American dream, and everybody growing up in every city can be part of it. Even if they don't start a company, they can be part of a startup and a growing company. And for the last several decades, there's been a massive brain drain where people growing up, as you mentioned, in Iowa are going to school in Michigan or other places.
Hey, wait, I went to Michigan. Let's not pick any other place except Michigan.
No, Michigan it's a great example. The University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, it's where Larry Page went and ended up being a Google founder. What if he had started Google in Ann Arbor? What kind of impact could that have? In Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon's the best university in terms of robotics. Even Uber and some of these cars are working on their driverless operations in Pittsburgh. But most people who graduated from Carnegie Mellon or these other schools did go to Silicon Valley or Boston or New York. There wasn't a lot of startup activity, innovation activity in those cities. So that led to this brain drain. And probably 95% of people living in Silicon Valley are from someplace else. They're there because that's the land of opportunity, in part because it's a great creative, disruptive culture, but also because that's where most of the money is. And so over time, we really want to create more of an opportunity everywhere. There are people pre-crisis that were starting to think of, maybe instead of being in a big city like New York, maybe I should be in a smaller city. Or maybe I want to go back to where I grew up, or maybe I want to go back to where I went to college, or there's some desire to do that, but they felt like couldn't really make the move because they would lose too much in terms of their potential kind of career opportunity or even entrepreneurial opportunity because of this issue of access to capital. My guess is it goes back to this being kind of this shake the snow globe moment. There are more families now having that conversation. It likely will result in a boomerang of some people returning, and it's a big but, we need to make sure the capital really is there, that the angel networks that have started to mobilize continue to invest, as opposed to, because of the crisis, pull back, that some of the regional venture funds have started can continue to scale. Some of the new ones that are being created can get the initial funding they need, and also encourage the coastal investors to at least occasionally get on planes to visit entrepreneurs in the middle of the country and back those entrepreneurs in the middle of the country. So there's some risk that this crisis might slow the capital flows more going to other people in other places and slow this rise the rest momentum. I'm concerned about that. We want to do everything we can to make sure those capital flows continue to accelerate, because we do believe the talent flows are poised to accelerate, but you got to match the capital and the talent together.
Do you expect, and I'll come back to capital in a minute, would you expect to see more startups possibly in these, I'll call them secondary cities? It's not the right, and I live in one, I'd live in Philadelphia. I know you're close with, the folks in Tampa, right? What Bill Gates and Jeff Vinnick are doing in Tampa when they're building up. Would you expect more startups because of all of this to start in those areas? It's like, it's a lower cost base. My real estate's less, employees are less, services are less. It's lifestyle. It's like I'm living in Tampa or Park City or Chattanooga, Tennessee. Would you expect to see more startups coming from those cities?
Yes, and some of that started happening pre-crisis. Even some of the biggest companies, Facebook, Google, et cetera, have open offices in Pittsburgh or Ann Arbor or other places, recognizing that they're at risk in trying to have their workforce exclusively in, say, Silicon Valley. They needed to have a more dispersed regional force. Amazon obviously got a lot of publicity around their second headquarters, search, and ultimately decided in the D.C., Northern Virginia area. So that trend had already started to accelerate. As a result, some of those graduates from some of those universities that might have 10 years ago left to go to the coast were more able to stay. And as a result, you are seeing more startup activity in more of these different cities. The cities need to do more to drive more collaboration, drive more of that sense of possibility, encourage the risk-taking that entrepreneurs do. And there needs to be more capital. But there definitely is a momentum building that should result in these second and third tier cities from a size standpoint. They often have better advantage than first tier cities in terms of a lot of the lifestyle, cultural, even educational kind of benefits. We think there is an opportunity to level that playing field, and it hopefully will accelerate because of this crisis.
It's interesting. Last point I just wanted to hit in this is, and you kind of brought this up, large companies adjusting for that remote workforce kind of policy, right? You hear what happened with Twitter yesterday, right? Twitter announced everybody can work from home forever. And it was kind of interesting how they said that, but you can come back to the office. But it'll be interesting if companies, they actually literally modify their policies. Like, this is working. You want to work from home? Work from wherever you want if you can.
There have been some very successful kind of remote companies. WordPress is probably the most visible, where they have an entirely kind of remote workforce. Most people thought that was kind of weird. Now they're realizing it's much more possible. And as the big companies, as you mentioned, Twitter, but there are many others, allow people to work remotely. Well, if you can work remotely, why would you live in that large city where it is? You do have more of a cost of living disadvantage. You do have other challenges you need to deal with. If you can have the job you love and the opportunity you want, and be someplace else, maybe I should be someplace else. And that also will accelerate the flows of capital. And I think that will ultimately help these cities to rise up. Like, as I mentioned before, 75% of capital going to 3 states. I think that will decline. There'll be less going to those 3 states. They'll still be the winners. Silicon Valley still will be the leader of the pack for sure by quite a distance. But other cities that we visited and invested in, whether it be Columbus or Cincinnati or Madison or Des Moines or Denver or Atlanta, New Orleans, you could kind of list. We've now visited 45 cities as part of our Rise of the Rest effort. They're all showing momentum in terms of what's possible, and there's a sense of excitement about this next wave and creating a stronger startup culture. I do think this crisis can help be a catalyst, a tipping point for that. But those communities really need to make sure they're embracing their entrepreneurs, particularly at this time of difficulty. The capital to help these companies start and scale is still there. The partnership locally between the university and the big companies and the mayor's office and the small companies is even tighter. This is a moment to seize, to really try to do what we can to help the rest rise.
That's right. It's great. So I want to just a little deeper, fifth, final topic, right? So these new innovation ecosystems and venture capital. Love to get some of your expectations. Again, you said, the vast majority go to 3 states. And, you think that there's going to be startup growth, not only in those areas, but other areas as well. Would you expect in this last thing to talk about topic, will venture investing shift? So let me give you a couple of thoughts and get your reactions. If we're at this, meaning COVID, there's a vaccine, there isn't a vaccine, there's a therapy, there isn't a therapy. If we're at this for 1 to 2 years of this, whatever this is, distance, social distancing, all of that, do you think investors are going to invest? Do you think more or less, like if you said, you'll get on a plane, I don't know the next time if an investor is in Menlo Park, are they hopping on a plane to fly to Chicago? Is that going to happen 3 months from now, 6 months from now? Do you think they're going to start investing in, these other areas that aren't secondary cities? Do you think it'll be a catalyst, or more or less, I guess, because of all of this, are those investors in the big hubs going to invest more and less in these secondary markets today?
Well, what was happening before the crisis is there was a growing recognition that a lot of these rising cities were in fact rising. The talent there was pretty impressive. The ability to do at least some things more remotely was starting to become more and more possible. And importantly, it goes back to what you're asking about the book I wrote, The Third Wave. The domain expertise in many of those sectors with the universities and the key partners in many of these sectors of large Fortune 500 companies are in the middle of the country. In healthcare, for example, Mayo Clinic in Minnesota or MD Anderson in Texas or the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio are among some of the very, very, very best in the nation. If you're trying to move forward with some innovation, they are people you want to partner with. Some of the largest and most powerful healthcare companies, like United Health, is in Minnesota. The HCA is in Tennessee. So the partnerships and that you need to form and the expertise you need to leverage is in the middle of the country. And so that's why more venture capitalists were starting to sense maybe they should not just focus on investing in their backyard, but investing more broadly. This crisis, as I said earlier, could be a positive, it could be an accelerant, or it could lead, as you're suggesting, some to say, well, it was kind of always a little bit of an inconvenience. Now I'm a little worried about it, so I'm going to just invest in companies I can drive to or bike to or something, and they'd be less likely to get on planes. That would hurt the development of these rising cities. Our hope is that people will realize that's where the opportunity increasingly will be in the third wave. Also, as you know, valuations often are lower there because of classic supply demand. So investors, when they do hit it, and a company like Duo Security in Ann Arbor or ExactTarget in Indianapolis, there's now 7 or 8 multi-billion-dollar SaaS companies in Provo, Utah. When people see that kind of momentum, they say, well, that is a great investment opportunity. I should do more of that. My hope is that that flow of capital will accelerate as this third wave really kind of accelerates as well.
On that same note, here's a question and expectation. If you look at Dreamit, we've probably closed rounds. Most of them aren't even announced yet. We've probably closed 2 or 3 funding rounds into companies in the last couple of weeks. Most of those started pre, all this craziness. Would you expect going forward that people are going to pitch over Zoom and close over Zoom and never be face to face? Do you think deals can be done this way today? If I'm in one of those distant cities and the investors in the Bay Area, it's all over a distance, all over Zoom.
I think it's possible. We've actually done some of that in the last couple of months ourselves at Revolution, but it is easier at the earlier stage, sort of more of the seed stage, when your initial check is lower, usually part of a group of people that are investing together. I think it would be more challenging at the later, for us, Revolution growth stage to make a $30 or $40 million investment without actually visiting the company and meeting face to face with the entrepreneurs. Maybe that will change, but likely I think the deals happening right now are the deals where something was already in process before, and there's now kind of a negotiation. Maybe some of the terms have changed. Maybe the valuation 3 months ago was viewed as too high, and now it's a little bit lower, and so a deal can get done. It's a little harder to surface those new deals, particularly at the later stage in an entirely remote environment. I'm sure it'll happen. It probably will accelerate in the coming months because we're in this for a while. But that side of things, I would expect to be a little less of a remote only world than you see on the venture and certainly seed side.
It's interesting. I heard a VC talk about on a discussion panel the other day. They said, I wanted to really meet this early stage company. It was interesting. And we're both in the Bay Area. And I said, could you meet me at the park? And he pitched me socially distanced walking through the park together. I was like, okay, is that what it's going to come down to? that pitch me, but we just can't be in the same room and let's be outside, which is different than pitching over Zoom. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Do you have about 10 more minutes we have about 10 questions in queue for you, if you don't mind. The first one, by the way, I wrote the first question was just for me. I just wanted to ask this, something I thought of late last night that I threw and I even put on Twitter. So let me go through, really appreciate your time. Let's go through the questions right now. First question is going to come up. Dustin will probably bring it up bottom third, and I'll read it in case you can't see it. But the first question says, are there second order opportunities from these possible shifts that are mentioned? Think blue jeans and pickaxes. You use Provo as an example. So if there's a blossoming of more startups in these secondary cities, what are the second order effects? If Chattanooga, if Wichita, there's more and more startups, are there, again, it's like the gold rush, like there's blue jeans and pickaxes, second order effects of things you might expect to see happen?
Well, the reason it's so important, just from a public policy standpoint, to level this playing field and get startups starting everywhere, is if you look at the data, essentially startups create all the jobs in our country. Small businesses account for a lot of jobs in aggregate, obviously incredibly important. That's why there's so much focus now on trying to protect them. But as a sector, don't actually add jobs, because one restaurant goes out of business and it's replaced probably by another restaurant. They probably employ about the same number of people. The biggest companies, the Fortune 500 companies, also don't create jobs. Some are growing, obviously, like Amazon. Some, like GE, are declining. The job creation is happening from the startups. And then there's a spin-off effect that, from the startup jobs that create the jobs in retail and restaurants and and home builders and other kinds of things. And we saw that as AOL grew, it wasn't just about the employees we had, it was a ripple effect throughout the community. So absolutely there'll be ripple effects. A little bit like when the interstate system was built, suddenly there were a lot of opportunities for motels and fast food restaurants and other things that were developed. If we can create startups everywhere, back startups everywhere, they're creating jobs everywhere. It's not just about the startup jobs being created, but all kinds of jobs also being created in those communities.
And I think for entrepreneurs watching and startups watching, it's an interesting thing. It's not the obvious thing that's straight down the middle. It's that tangential. Because this is happening, there's this new opportunity I realized that's not so obvious that it's kind of interesting. All right, let's go to our next question. Next question says, let me just read this. What cities do you think may see the largest outflow of talent? Any that people are like, that's it.
In terms of outflow of talent, it's where there's been significant inflows in the last 20 years. And I do believe that cities are important. I think it's a little harder to build. There's some who obviously done it with entirely remote workforces, but in general, there is something to clustering of people, clustering of talent. Our argument with the Rise of the Rest is it doesn't just have to be San Francisco and New York. It can be other cities all around the country. So I think you'll see a migration. You saw a migration from people in the middle of the country having to go to the coast. I think you'll start seeing that boomerang of migration going to different cities, and some of these kind of cities that might have 500,000 people now have the opportunity to be growing.
Okay, interesting. Okay, and go to our next question. We're going through about 6 more to go. Next question: do you feel there's more investment opportunity at the seed, venture, or growth stages? So I guess you have 3 different funds, right? So they're asking around that. Is there more opportunity, seed, venture, growth? You're spanning all 3.
We see opportunity at all 3 stages. There's still a lot of companies getting started, which enable us to invest at the seed level. Some of those companies get to the next level on the venture side, and a subset of those get to the next level on the growth side. So we actually believe there are a lot of opportunities. Our focus, as I mentioned, because of Rise of the Rest, is not just looking where everybody else seems to be looking in Silicon Valley, but making the effort to look in other places and look for particularly companies in these third wave sectors. But we think the next 10 years are going to be terrific years for entrepreneurs everywhere across the country and across these different sectors.
Okay. Let's hit our next question. Next question says, so I'm just looking at a spreadsheet, any suggestions on how to pivot? Questions I should be asking or answering? I think you said at one point, companies don't look at it as a negative. It's almost lemons from lemonade. Where's the opportunity? So again, any suggestions on how to pivot, questions I should be asking myself or answering? Thoughts?
Well, it certainly depends on the sector, depends on the company and stage and so forth. But I think the starting point is to really spend the time to imagine in whatever you're doing, what it might look like 10 years from now, how the world might change 10 years from now. This was one of the key things we kept trying to do at AOL, just try to imagine kind of way out front, what was it likely to look like? And then kind of take a step back and figure out how you get from where you are to where you think it's going to go, and try to be a little bit in front of that. The Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, people say he was a great hockey player. He didn't focus where the puck was. He focused on where the puck was going. You got to focus on where the puck is going. And then like Gretzky, just get there a little bit before somebody else gets there to be able to capitalize on that opportunity. But it starts with a passion about what you're doing and a perspective in terms of how it's going to change and how you can benefit, maybe even drive that change.
Okay, great. Let's go to our next question. Okay, interesting. Since it will be hard to travel, could the opposite be true? Maybe move closer to venture. So I guess what we were talking about with the venture, tends to focus in, 3 key areas. That's where a lot of the VCs themselves are. I guess, do I get closer to go for a walk in the park? Do I move to the Bay Area? And just the opposite is true. Any thoughts?
Some will. I mean, obviously that has been the history of the last 20 years, where people felt like that's where they need to go, because that's sort of, like I said, I can't remember who the famous bank robber is. Why did they rob the bank? Well, that's where the money is. That's where the money is.
Sutton,
so that's Willie Sutton, exactly. Right. So that has been the dynamic. Some people will choose to do that. I think more will choose to stay where they are because they sense there's something happening there and they want to be part of that. They want to tap into some of the expertise where they are in terms of some of these third wave sectors. I do think some people will start boomeranging back to these other places. But obviously, it's a lot of people will make different choices. The question is, how do you take a step back and what are the macro trends? My hope, and there's obviously no guarantee of it, my hope is this mass migration that's happened that's sort of hollowed out the innovation economy in many parts of the country and really helped a few places on the coast. We'll see a readjustment a new kind of migration where people start going to back in the middle of the country and back to some of these cities that are a little bit smaller, a little bit more livable, a little bit lower cost of living. And if that happens, if the talent is there, the capital will follow.
That's interesting. By the way, I know even a VC firm, just because I know Park City, Utah well, there's a VC firm in Park City, Utah. It's really interesting. We hire people. If you love to do finance and venture and also appreciate great outdoors and great skiing, you should come work with us. And if you don't like any of that, don't. And he's like, the number of people we get applying because they choose that. They're like, I want to be there. Oh my God, I can. Now that's because the company happens to be there and it's an interesting town, but
also there's some history to this because even 50 years ago, 75 years ago, if you wanted to be in the movie business, you had to be in Hollywood
or New York,
right, or Hollywood. Was.
Yeah.
Well, today, a lot of people still choose to be in Hollywood, but many people are making movies, music, other things all across the country, indeed all across the world. Similarly, 50 years ago, if you wanted to be in the financial services business, the sense was you had to be in New York. You had to be on Wall Street. Some people choose to be in New York and are on Wall Street far more, or whether it be private equity or hedge funds or other kinds of vehicles are deciding to locate in other places. So I think the same dynamic will happen in the tech sector and the startup sector over the next 10, 20 years.
Okay, cool. 3 more questions, then we're done. Next question is from Zeke Hughes. Thanks, Zeke, for asking. It's a little bit long, but I'll read it. Especially if distributed work is here to stay, what software's role in imbuing workflow and productivity tools with human social-centered design? Should developers design for social good or stick to what they're good at, customer acquisition and engagement? I don't know if that made sense, but
I think I understand the question, and the answer is again varied. I think clearly, as we're seeing in this work from home environment, whether it be Zoom or Slack, or a lot of things have accelerated in terms of adoption because people are understanding the importance of it. At the same time, there are a lot of focus now on trying to develop Zoom for particular sectors. Maybe a broad platform like that isn't perfect for every possible interaction. Maybe classroom should be different than business meetings. And so there's going to be some innovation there and a continuing kind of reassessing of what is the best way to create the best possible kind of work environment, which will include these hybrids. Some people will choose to go back to the office and work in the office, maybe exclusively or at least mostly. Some may choose to be more in a remote work from home environment. One of the challenges is how do you bridge those worlds and make sure the people who aren't there in the office aren't feeling kind of left out. So there's all kinds of opportunities for entrepreneurs to create the right kind of technologies, software, other kinds of things that are supportive of this new work environment.
Okay. Last 2 questions. Next question, thank you, is from John Houghton. John asks, what was one of the most unexpected, fun, and fulfilling stories from the Rise of the Rest tour?
Well, we've now, as I said, been to 45 cities, so it's sort of kind of like asking what's your favorite child. There's been great things that have been happening in each of the cities. For example, our last tour, we were in Florida, went to the Space Coast, where obviously half a century ago, Apollo 11, all this activity, the space race was launched. We saw some really interesting things there around space technologies that were not just from the large companies that historically were dominating, but from the small companies. When we were in Chattanooga, there was a company we saw called FreightWaves that was doing some interesting things around the trucking industry. And actually, I didn't know this, but Chattanooga has the best high-speed access in the country because the mayor decided to fight the telephone company and build it for the different cities. So each of these cities have had great stories where people are doing innovative things to try to help the startup community, help the cities come together to back this next wave of innovation. One of the reasons we love doing it is it connects us to a lot of people and extends our network, and including of regional venture funds we can co-invest in. But also we just love meeting the entrepreneurs, visiting these cities, understanding the unique dynamics of these cities, how they helped build America. 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. Now we're the leader of the pack because of the work of entrepreneurs, and that work in the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, or more recently, the technology revolution happened all over the country. And each of these cities essentially has a backstory in terms of the role they played in building the country. So it's great to hit the road and understand those stories and meet those people.
That's cool. I thought it was going to be, I think I was talking to Tracy on your team a week or two ago. And I'd said to you, by the way, in last year's tour, which I remember, how did you ever get the bus to Puerto Rico? I thought that was going to be your fun. Oh, we figured out how to get the bus to Puerto Rico. Well, get a different bus and wrap it.
My friend, Jose Andres, the chef who's led now World Central Kitchen, a lot of relief efforts, in addition to running a lot of restaurants, it was part of the whole Puerto Rico relief effort. And so he was the one who got us to instead of driving the bus to Puerto Rico, which you mentioned is not possible, we
little challenging.
Created a new bus there.
Right.
But it was a great day, and seeing how they were shifting from relief to recovery, which I think will be the theme coming out of COVID. How do we move from that kind of relief, get through it mode to more of a recovery, rebuilding mode, and it was a great day.
Great. Okay, last question is from Santush Sarma. I hope I pronounced that correctly. How's the road to recovery for the advertising sector, specifically speaking to the DOOH space, which is digital out-of-home advertising? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the different sectors are going to recover in different kind of ways. There clearly has been, I haven't seen the latest data from Facebook or Google, but clearly from what we're hearing anecdotally from a lot of the companies we back, there's been a pullback in advertising spend that actually has created opportunity for some of the companies we've backed. They've actually accelerated their marketing because the acquisition cost has decreased. So now's maybe the best possible time to gain market share and have more marketing efficiency. So in general, people are pulling back because of people are not quite as active in terms of obviously traveling or being out and even in buying things other than e-commerce. But there's some sectors that are really using this again as an opportunity. Again, the terrible problems we're dealing with, and it's going to take a while to get out of this, economically and certainly from a health crisis standpoint. But there are also opportunities. I think the entrepreneurs that we're particularly pleased to be working with are the ones who manage the challenges they're dealing with and take them very seriously, including the safety of their employees and customers and so forth, but also are focusing on the new possibilities and how do you kind of build on this and be well positioned, better positioned coming out of this than you were going into this.
Right, exactly. Great. Terrific. I don't want to take too much more of your time. We've been on for an hour. This has been terrific. Really appreciate your time. Appreciate your comments and all of your thoughts that you've given here. Let me just wrap things up with you real quick. So again, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the show. For people that are watching now, catch our next show. If you get a chance, you might catch it. I don't know if you know, there's an author, Annie Duke. I don't know if you know. She has a book out on thinking in bets. Annie is terrific. She's going to be on with us June 3rd talking about how do you take that thinking in bet paradigm, and if I'm a startup founder, how do I use that approach? And if you haven't read her book, our son I was talking to about yesterday, he's now going to read her book. Terrific book. She's going to be on with us June 3rd. How do you apply that thinking in bets paradigm as both a VC and as a startup founder? So please make sure to catch that. All of our future and past episodes, you can go to dreamit.com/live. And if you get a chance, check out our Dreamit doses on YouTube. There are all these that might be great for your portfolio companies too. We just get a little frustrated with startups. They always make the same mistakes in their pitch. So we do these little 5 to 7 minute segments, how to talk about competition, total addressable market, all these things they mess up. So check out the Dreamit dose on YouTube. Steve, thank you so very much for your time. It was great to see you. I'm glad all is well. Stay well, and thanks for being on Dreamit Live.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be with you, and everybody out there, thanks for listening, and you also stay well.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.